this presentation, so it was, so if you think back in time, how it was sort of my evolution of trying to get people to change the way they think about what we do in security from a DevOps perspective. The Abraham Wald story, you probably heard it, you just haven't heard it with his name. So during World War II, there were a bunch of mathematicians and statisticians where their job was to figure out how to do weight distribution and repair of fighter planes that came back with bullet holes. And so this Abraham Wald one day just sort of woke up and said, it's really sort of the definition of survivor bias, which was, wait a minute, we're repairing the planes where the bullet holes are. They're the ones that are coming back. We should be repairing the planes where the bullet holes aren't, because they're the ones that aren't coming back, right? And I think that's a great metaphor for the way we think about, security. Like we sort of look for, maybe we're looking in the wrong place for all the things. And so I asked this meta question. This was about 3 or 4 years ago, which I hope it makes your brain hurt a little bit sort of in the Abraham Walding way. What if DevSecOps happened before DevOps? Would the world be different? Because if you think about it, like, again, I'm pro DevSecOps. I think everybody should have a good DevSecOps reference architecture. But basically what happened was we did all this DevOps work, and then we put an overlay of like security on it. And that's good, necessary. But maybe did we already have this bias of bullet holes when we were thinking about that? And what if like we started with the security? What if some security person said, I got a great way to do security. I'm going to call it DevSecOps. And we started in that order. Like, could things be different? Would we be thinking differently, or have we not thought differently? So Sarah Leitz, who is one of my mentors, she says, and it sounds simple, and she wrote the DevSecOps manifesto. She coined the term. Everyone is responsible for security. And so we were talking at the break about this 3 lines of defense. And so I don't come from an auditor background, all I know is I get brought into all these companies and they would ask like, hey John, look at our DevSecOps reference architecture. Like, that's awesome. And like, you did that. Wow, that was awesome. That was awesome. And then we'd have a conversation. They'd say, we'd by the 3 lines of defense model. And I was like, yeah, that one, not so awesome. Because Andrew Clay Schaefer, like in the earliest days of DevOps, pre-DevSecOps, made this beautiful caricature of what described the problem of the original DevOps problem statement, which was, he said that there was this wall of confusion. And some of you people that look like you might be close to as old as I am, but there was a day when developers would throw their code over the wall, operations would catch it, and they'd say, it doesn't work. And they'd say, no, you broke it, it works. And like this would go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And Andrew would talk about like let's just figure out a way to break that wall. Right, and there was some of the original DevOps was these beautiful stories of Dev and Ops working together and collaboration, and like you have a whole industry that's been built out of it. So there's busting the wall, and it becomes a metaphor for any non-collaborative groups in an organization. And so I was, when I was thinking about what was the problem statement that drove DevOps, where are we now with the problem statement of what happens in a large organization between first line, second line, and third line? And the way I view when I have these conversations, second line is by definition a buffer for the third line. Second line has no way to communicate with the first line. This is what Dev and Ops looked like 15 years ago. We didn't have the tools. We didn't even have the cognitive mapping to have those discussions. We didn't even know that we should be having those discussions. So like, and like I said, in the Investors Unlimited, we have a short description about like, I'm not gonna go to the Institute of Internal Auditors and say, hey, I'm John Willis, you never heard of me, get rid of 3 lines of defense, right? That ain't happening. But what I am gonna say is, just like we do with separation of duties, could we reframe, and we did this a little bit in the book, the conversation of how we think about this. Why can't we create that DSL I talked about where second line can meet first line in designer requirements? And here's the kicker, right? Like, I don't know. I don't claim to be a genius about all things. But what I do know is every bank and every company I've walked in, what's the purpose of that second line? They're basically to make sure they do the job that they need to do. What's the job they need to do? Protect the brand. That's it, right? I mean, like everything falls under protect the brand. Like, and you know, and again, when you're Equifax and you lose 5 billion market cap in a day, or you're another company called Knight Capital that was the second largest high frequency trading company on the NYSE that lost $440 million in 45 minutes and was out of business in 24 hours. Like, that's what they're supposed to do. And our relationship now is to basically hide things from them, you know, like don't tell them, oh my goodness, right? Like that's gotta change. And that's why we get into Equifaxes and Knight Capitals and Capital Ones. So what would he do? Like I have this idea that like when I start thinking about security, I'm like if you ever been to RSA and you go into the exhibition hall in RSA, you're like, I gotta get out of here. There's too many lights, there's too many vendors, this is just too confusing. It was almost impossible to come up with a taxonomy for security because there's just so many ways to discuss it and look at it. So I started thinking about like, how do I make it simple? Could I come up with a, and like, I always say like, until I get punched in the face for saying this, you know, I'll keep saying it and nobody's punched me in the face yet. So like a post-cloud native world or using cloud native as the marker to make the conversation simpler. Now, I'm not implying that like security doesn't exist for legacy and mainframes. It certainly does. But we could have a simpler conversation if we just assumed there was a line that we could say everything to the right is cloud native. And so with that, I will tell you that what we need to do and what we do are inconsistent. You know, what we need to do, or what we do is, how do we prove we're safe? Well, we have some form of usually subjective audit, ServiceNow records that tell stories about things that might lead to screen prints. And then how do we demonstrate? We have the poor second line or internal auditors or external auditors try to figure out what all those subjective descriptions are. And we need to do both. So we need to be able to make a system that can prove we're safe and be very consistent to what we demonstrate. Right? And that's the whole point of something like Kosli, or just in general, this idea of, you know, digitally signed immutable data that represents what we say we do. So then the audit isn't a subjective 40-day conversation. It's a 1-second look at this SHA, and we're done. Right? So we move from implicit security models to explicit proof models. We change subjective to objective, and then verifiable. And so back to the cloud native model is, if you can accept that I think there's a world that's right, a post-cloud native world, then I can tell you that I can give you a simple taxonomy for thinking about security and not having to think about it in like 40 horizontal and 50 vertical ways. Right? I did that wrong, but hey, nobody caught it. That's when you should drink water on, is when somebody makes it. Yeah. But I said, and I worked with a couple of groups, and I started hearing from these CISOs, and I said, you know, I think we can, like, I don't want to call it taxonomy, but we can look at it as risk, defense, and trust, and we can look at it as a transition from subjective, objective to verifiable. So we went through in the last presentation, in 20 minutes, the risk from change to attestation. I didn't talk about continuous verification, but there's really interesting products that are basically trying to use Chaos Monkey-like tools to go beyond just breaking things to actually verify. Like, for example, if this port should never be open, let's just open the port. If this vulnerability should have never gotten through the pipeline, let's launch an application that has that vulnerability, right? So there's some really interesting called continuous verification. And then, I'll spend a little more on that, but then on defense, you know, it's table stakes to detect and respond, our SIM and our SOAR and all that stuff, right? And then everybody's basically trying to build a data lake right now, cyber data lake, right? That's the sort of the in-hip thing to do. And I'm not making fun of it, it's required. But like, there's some real thought process that isn't happening about how do you build a cyber data lake that isn't just a bunch of junk. You know, so there's a couple of vendors and projects are thinking about, like, could we normalize data at ingest, like coming out of the provider? So for example, you take a message that might come from Amazon, the same message might come from Google Cloud and might come from like Oracle, and it might be the same thing, like an increased privileges. but the message is completely different. There's no normalization. And so if you shove that all the way to the right in a cyber data lake, one, you're gonna have a hard time figuring out what even the message is, let alone each one of them has a different meta definition for the ID, all that stuff. And at some point, you really want to attach to that a NIST or a MITRE ATT&CK framework tactic. Like, so let's do all that on the left side. And there's some good work happening there. And then the trust thing is interesting too, because the thing that we're seeing, so if anybody had followed the SDN, so when Mike said I sold the company to Docker, what I actually did is I had this like crazy idea of, could we do software-defined networking in containers? We did it. We literally, me and this guy who was, pretty much invented software-defined networking. We built it, and as this whole idea of how you do trust and build around it. If you think about SDN, right, it was changing a north-south paradigm of how traffic came in and out to east-west. So if you looked at some of the traffic patterns, going back 15, 20 years ago, it was 90% of your traffic was north-south. And then all of a sudden, the more you got into sort of high-scaled service, service mesh, service, all that stuff, it flipped. It went to 80% east-west. And we built network around that. Well, I believe we have to do that for trust now. And we already see evidence of this when we start getting into Kubernetes and clusters and stuff like that. We're seeing sort of like if you've heard of Spiffy and Spire, some of the new service mesh stuff, ambient mesh, I'm throwing out a lot of terms, but there is this possibility to, instead of building this sort of on or off north-south trust, we could create ephemeral trust within a cluster and it goes away. So even things like secrets management, like I think Vault is a great product today, but that stuff could happen really at the mesh level where like a secret just exists in this clustered pod or cluster for the life of the cluster. And by the way, you're in or you're out. Like you're authorized for that cluster. So I think the Spiffy, so I think there's incredibly interesting stuff around what I call, moving, and zero trust is table stakes, right? Like, okay, fine. But like, I'm talking about more of a, let's really go to a level of trust where if the world is gonna be, I don't know if it's Kubernetes, but it's definitely be cluster-based compute. And then we could build our trust around that model. I know it sounds sort of crazy, but hey. So risk differently, we talked about this, investments unlimited. Oh, this was the Capital One breach, which is fun. Fun for everybody except Capital One, but hey. So basically, this was the stretch to Jakarta, right? This is the stretch to Jakarta. Oh, wait a minute, this is the Equifax, but that's fine. So what happened was there was a vulnerability in in the stretch 2 library, which almost everybody uses, where if you are on an authorized system, you put a command in, it runs, and if that authorized system, you can do whatever you want. This is what I told you about the breach, but this one's a little more interesting. This is Capital One's breach. So this is like the, like if you follow like aviation disasters, it's like the Air France 447 of computing, if that makes any sense to anybody. So what was interesting about this one is they were basically rolling IDSs. So there was this window of anywhere from like seconds to about 5 minutes where adversary could poke in. There was this woman who was a crypto miner who basically runs 1 billion curls a day, basically looking for one person to put up a proxy with the defaults on. This team that was in a hurry got an exception, put up a proxy that left the defaults, and this one proxy, the default was bypass was on. So this crypto miner got really lucky because the IDS was rolling, they popped through, they hit that IP address is a hardware address that anybody who's ever worked with Amazon Web Service knows is the metadata server. So basically CapitalOne.com $URL equals the metadata server. And then they happened, because they were in a hurry, they probably cut and paste from Stack Overflow some VPC definitions, and they were privileged. So they got right through, were able to dump the privileges, assume a super usage power. Meanwhile, some developer left 100 million business credit card applications in an S3 bucket, right? Swarm through. Here's where it gets really worse. In business card, credit card, like so the the PSIDSS requires Social Security numbers be tokenized, right? But it doesn't require the corporation ID to be that. And in most sort of like, I'm sure it's everywhere, but S-Corps, basically half of the S-Corp small businesses, they use their Social Security number as the corporation ID. So they, so again, there's just all these loopholes that happen, right? And that's called server-side request forgery. I was actually brought into SolarWinds to, one of the authors of the book worked for a Big Four, a Big Five, and they wanted to get the contract of the cleanup job. So, I was brought in to talk about, automated governance. Again, like we can make fun of SolarWinds all day long, but like every software company out there is basically as bad as they are. So by the way, all your software that you're buying, now that I actually don't work for a software company, we're SaaS-based. We're good. But no, I mean, they're all, you look at what SolarWinds was, and it was terrible. Like the pipelines, and it was horrendous. And so I go in talking about advanced stuff, and they're like, no, we just got to get DevOps. So they weren't really that interested. But I thought I'd be Johnny on the spot and go in there and take the CrowdStrike MITRE ATT&CK framework and say, all right, I'm going to now really show these guys why they should use. Because basically what happened was the adversary got into the compiler, Microsoft compiler. This is supply chain attacks. These are the really scary ones, right? Where they're not even going after you. They're going after whoever you're delivering stuff to. So they got into there, and by the way, they apparently they rolled their logs after 18 months, so they don't even know how long they were in there, right? They could have been there for years. And so the CrowdStrike did a really good analysis, and one of the ones that I just caught, in fact, it's in our demo, that's why it's in our demo, was they weren't checking, they were going to have it in the demo, the image SHA, the image SHA. So, so what happened is they sit on MS Build and they start injecting nefarious code into it so that when that product goes out to the Department of Defense or the bank, they've got this open backdoor out there. And a table stakes sort of attestation would be like if it's Canadian image or a jar file, is doing a baseline SHA and be able to look before or after and be able to see like should have been this, and there's other ways to sort of detect. And the other thing was really interesting why like this idea of automated governance has to have an immutable data store, non-tamperable, is they went in and they obfuscated logs. That's really scary. If they get to live in your company, and by the way, they're in your company right now. Like, don't think they're not there. Now, they may not be finding a way around to do real damage, but you are incredibly naive if you don't think there are adversaries sitting in your corporation. There's polymorphic malware. Like, I could spend extra 20 minutes explaining how polymorphic malware works. They're in your company. The question is how hard it is, or what are the opportunities that arise, the Air France 447s that allow them to sort of get to the next step, and if they're really smart, this is where it gets really scary, they actually can tamper with the logs to remove the evidence that they actually did things. One of the biggest things at Equifax, when that was said and done, I think I got 6 minutes left, so I can tell the story. The Equifax story is really interesting. A lot of people work at Equifax, and so their external auditors are like the thing that like drove almost everybody to quit for the next 2 years after the breach was they wanted everybody there to prove the negative. And note the negative was, like, in other words, they were like, you know what? We survived the nightmare because they didn't change the data. That's the scary thing. It's one thing to have an adversary that dumps a bunch of confidential data out in the wild, and that's not good. It's going to hurt the brand. You'll go out of business if they change your system of record data and they publish that your system of if you're a bank and I change your accounts and I'm in there they were in Marriott for 5 years. That breach, 5 years they were in there. So if they're really smart, and this is evidence that they do this. So not only they might mutate your data, they'll mutate the evidence of the data. That's why it has to be in an immutable, non-tamperable store. Defense differently, again, I talked a little about, I mean, you have to think about your side. Don't just build a cyber data lake. There's some really good opportunities to think about how you sort of ingest at the provider level. And there's a couple of providers now building these interesting SDKs that allow you to, you know, I can give you more about it. It's called Automated Cloud Governance. It's out of a group out of New York called ONUG, and where you can basically use these SDKs from basically Microsoft and Oracle and IBM and Google, where you can start building these sort of NIST user data. You can normalize the messages themselves. So by the time you get into the data lake, you're not doing like an incredible amount of compute consumption to try to correlate. And trust differently, you know, zero trust is table stakes, but I think the really interesting stuff becomes, well, certainly NIST 80207 and you know, and the good news is when I first was writing this, Spiffy and Spiral were just external projects. Now they're actually built into the Istio and Envoy and Service Mesh, so they're all there, right? But here's the other thing, and then SigStar is a really interesting Merkle tree-based solution that deserves to be looked at. But since I do have a couple of minutes left, the thing that I'm trying to get Mike and James and everybody really excited about is what's coming down the pike. And here's the thing. In the past, we had this buffer as IT or first-line people to know that the adversaries and the auditors, we are ahead of them. Like, we got Kubernetes, they won't figure out what all the dangers, you know, all the ghosts and dragons in Kubernetes until next year, right? Like, we've been sort of living that sort of delayed buffer. Well, now what's happening is the people who write the Google stuff, like Service Mesh, Istio, and Envoy, are now writing or getting contract by NIST to write the documentation. So now some of the incredibly dangerous stuff that's in Istio and Envoy, which is the Service Mesh part of Kubernetes, is well documented, you know, English, you know, easily read, and both the adversaries and the auditors can see that there's something called the blue-green deploy that used to only happen at layer 3, or basically what happened now is all the layer 3 stuff can happen at layer 7. And layer 3 stuff was switch config, which was very hard for an adversary to get in your system and tamper with that stuff. But now, an adversary just needs to find one leaky API with the YAML file, and they can basically say, you know what, I'm going to take 1% of all the payment traffic and send it to some latest version. And by the way, I haven't met a company or a bank. I ask people, have you ever heard of the Envoy? Do you even turn on the Envoy access log? What's that? So that means they're banks that are running production, customer payment, or funds-based stuff in Service Mesh, and they have no evidence of how. So this is, for people like Kosli and us who want to get ahead of the curve, a treasure trove. I mean, you know, it's stuff that's going to happen so fast, and people aren't even ready. And again, the takeaway is, don't think that, you know, we had the luxury of thinking about the adversaries. Oh, I don't think they'll figure that out. It's so advanced. The people who write Envoy, Istio, and that stuff are now writing this documentation on how it works. So the adversaries are not stupid. You know, when you tell them there's something called the blue-green deploy, they might not know what it is, but once they realize it's a reroute of traffic, then they'll know exactly what to do with it. Anyway, that's GPT-3 driven. All I put in is Botchagalupe and John Willis, and that's what I got. And the only thing I will say is, and this is probably worth drinking water, I think the internet thinks I'm a clown. So like, that's okay.
All right, we've got some time for Q&A at the moment. So I'll bring a couple of chairs up, and we can have a bit of a...
3 cheers.
We can imagine a fireside chat.
Sure. It's okay if I stand.
Yeah, sure. Then I'll sit.
Yeah, all right, that's fine. Yeah. All right, boss. He's my boss, so now he sits, I stand.
All right. Oh, I actually need the questions. So if you have any questions, of course, put them in on the QR code on your lanyard. So before we get into the questions from the audience, I'd like to pick up on what you were saying about the network stuff, because I have to say, when you started talking about this SDO and Envoy, I was like, oh, Can we just,
why did I hire this guy?
can we just stick with what we've got for now? Let's see what we've got. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I thought, oh wait, hold on, this is quite interesting, because again, it goes back to the DevOps story, because it's another example of things that used to be in another department in the business where the developers get so pissed off with it, they decide that, we're going to put this in software now. So first it was, it was build, it's security, it's deployments, it's
came along.
Cloud, it's containers. Like time after time, we talk about everything as code, but it's really developers doing civil disobedience against other parts of the org. In some way. So I'd like to, so networking is one area, but some of the conversations we've had this week are also about data. Maybe you could say a bit about that.
Oh yeah, I mean that's another thing. So one of the things that so the John Rosatowski guy at the PNC implemented this thing, and what was one of the first interesting conversations that happened after, and he built it, and our whole thought process was this is for software supply chain. And it turns out one of the API development teams saw it and said, hey, in fact, they did a pull request, they said, hey, by the way, we've built this system for API development workflow. Oh, that's interesting. Like the decisions, this isn't really a software-defined workflow. It's a workflow that shows evidence that the decisions you made in defining an API, right? Like leaky API, being able to, all that stuff. And it sort of opened up this idea that this is just a model for workflow evidence. And so I started thinking about what else are we doing, and right at the time, DataOps was starting, this concept of DataOps, right? Moving, like if you think about today, or go back 15, 20 years, let's say 20 years ago, there were a lot of big banks that the way they put software into production was they just put the software into production. And then DevOps came with CI and CD, and then DevOps, it'd be very rare and almost probably pretty close to criminal if that happened in a large bank today, right? There are people that sort of bypass the system, but in general, I don't run into any financial organizations that don't have some form of a pipeline, right? But those same organizations have developers that stuff 145 million business credit cards into an S3 bucket through no operational pattern, right? And so this movement of DataOps is, well, could we do a workflow for how we move data? And we've been sort of doing it with data warehouse forever, but now so when a developer wants to get some data, there should be a process of how you sort of tokenize it. Does it get ETL'd? What's the evidence? So when it's sitting in an S3 bucket, so imagine then, before I met Kosli, but now we just had a conversation with somebody that this could be Kosli. So imagine all the way that you're processing data. You're taking it from the raw data, maybe your ETL process, maybe you're sort of tokenizing, maybe it's going through Kafka and doing this, and this, and it's winding up here. What if you were keeping these Kosli or just this attestational evidence all the way so that when it goes to the S3 bucket, you could reject it, just like you could reject the fail a build. Or even better, have a scanner that's scanning all the basically S3 buckets, looking for any data that doesn't have a verifiable meta of evidence. So that's something that, again, the two worlds have to mature and meet together, and I think we're getting, the more the conversations that happen about DataOps, the more it puts us in a better, or anybody who's doing this model of that kind of evidence should naturally happen, and it could happen for it. I've seen people talk about it for doing modeling, for example, Monte Carlo modeling, right? What were the decisions that you made, and what's the data that shows? Because when the model runs, right, it's force de jour, right? I mean, at that point, once it's been trained, it's going to do what it does. Now, if it does really bad stuff, at least I can show evidence that these are the decisions that we made when we were building the model. This gentleman had a question right there. And I know you. You gave a great presentation the other night.
Thanks. I was just thinking about the information within the data and what we're... kind of the situation that we are in is that the regulations, they keep changing. Everything changes, right? So if we even have this tokenization or verification of the data that you're using, whatever it is in the architecture, if the regulations change, what are you going to do about it?
Well,
that was what I was thinking, because if you don't scan for it, but if you know where it is, that means that you can go out and you can pick it out So the GDPR regulations, you could say that, well, okay, we can't keep it for 6 months anymore.
Right.
It's only 3.
And if you get the meta, the meta will tell you everything. And
then you know where you have what. So you can actually change on the spot.
Beauty, and here's the beauty part of that, too, 'cause it's the same thing with the software delivery, right? Remember I said earlier, the beauty of having that DSL associated as an artifact in the evidence chain is because if the evidence today, if the requirements today are that you had to have this, this, and this, and then in 6 months now there's some executive order or whatever, we realize, oh, you had to have this, this, it's point-in-time evidence. Because the artifact is part of the evidence, so when you're looking at that data or that record, the evidence said you only had to have this. Well, it's even more true with data. With data, it'd be like you might have reclassified. You know, I did some work with Nike. You want to talk about how interesting their data classification is in the cloud. You know, you guys probably don't know who Michael Jordan is because you probably don't follow American basketball, but at the time, the ownership of his data at Nike is cherished as a bank's account data, right? Like the data about some of their big clients so data classification, but then how do you mature the meta around it? And I think that's a great point. Like if the policy changed that it needs to be from 6 months, 3 months, if you have the meta tagged, which this model I think works really well for that, then you could just scan around and say, okay, we got rid of all the data that's been sitting around for in 4 months that were used to be for 6 months, now it should be 3 months.
I think just to add to all of this, I agree with everything that's been said, but like, and you know, we know from the SRE book and from Google and so on that 70% of changes are 70% of system outages are due to changes in a live system. And we focus a lot on changes nowadays in the DevOps world about deployments, but there's so much change that isn't a deployment, right? There's a database migration, or a user is provisioned, or you know, somebody needs to fix up a record in a transaction or something. There's just so much more, but it's the same thing, right? The data currently is siloed, ephemeral, disconnected.
And we talked about this the other day. I mean, what are the basics? And I'll just call it the basic 4. It's probably 5, maybe 6. But what are the basic 4 of audit, right? When the change happened, who did the change, who approved the change, and then usually some variant of, you know, was it successful? Was there a backup plan? But like, and that's whether it's data, whether it's software artifact, whether it's configuration. And again, we've got, you know, when the auditors come in and ask about like this artifact, which is some library, you know, we still, without something like Kosli, you know, or a solution like that, we spend a lot of time grabbing a lot of stuff to prove it. But when they ask us that same question about database, I can tell you the answer is it's chaos. Because we don't, one, we don't use DataOps as a model, and 2, if we had DataOps, we could actually be more aligned with giving the evidence of like who made, you know, those should be standard 4 in any delivery of any workflow, whether it's an API, whether it's a Monte Carlo modeling, whether it's DataOps, or whether it's software delivery.
100% agree. But in the interest of getting through some of the other questions, we had a question from Axel, which I think is quite interesting. It's like, where do you think the CISO should be put in an organization? And like, both in terms of the formal setup, but like the activities and where they do it from. And it's an interesting question.
So I'll give you, I had a great conversation on the break, so I'll give you my first uneducated answer. And it's not too uneducated. Mark Schwartz, he's another writer for IT Revolution, and he's written a bunch of books, but one of his books is A Seat at the Table. And it's an interesting book that sort of talks about, are you really an IT company if your CIO isn't really on the real seat at the table? And actually, I've done these when I go into large companies, not that I'm talking to CEO. I do actually get to work for CIOs quite often, but not CEOs. I'm not, like, I don't dress well enough for that. But the question, and I like to find out, is where does your CIO sit? Do they sit on the kiddie table or the big grown-up table? Because if they're not on the grown-up table, I don't care how much you try to tell the world that you're a data company or a software company, you're not a software company. So he makes that point really well. And then he says that even like companies that do create this category of a chief, now this might offend some people, but he says that creating a chief data officer is basically an excuse that you're doing it terribly. Because why isn't that part of the CIO? Like, is data not part of information technology? So my only point is, the John Willis answer is, I don't care if you call it CIO or whatever you want to call it, but they all should be aligned why is security completely segregated? Like in our fictional, like compliance and risk is over here, the CISO's here, and CIO here. Like, oh, is security not information technology? Now, you had pointed out that there are some requirements where they have to be firewall. But then I go back to, like like John Willis doesn't say get rid of SOD, it doesn't get rid of 3 lines of defense. I say we have to reframe the way we do things. So if I can't change you structurally, I'm sure gonna, like, I'm not gonna get rid of the 3 lines of defense, but I'm gonna ask you until you kick me out of the building, why isn't the second line in designer requirements? You know, every time I talk to you, until you either tell me to get lost, or you finally say, okay, they're gonna start showing up, John. So I think that there's somewhere in, like, that's how you solve the problem where it's a hardwired regulation. You work around it by reframing the mindset and the collaboration.
But I think it's quite an interesting concept as well, because I know there's some banks, even in this room, that their second line doesn't report internally; it reports to the board as a kind of like as an independent control function, which makes a lot of sense. But it's interesting that you would take information security as a control function external, than an internal cultural thing that you need to.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the legacy of our company. Like, not only, so, you know, like I'd say like 5 years into the 10-year DevOps journey, like, oh my goodness, we forgot to bring security along. Well, our industry, you know, talks about like bleeding edge information. Banks say, I want to be, I've seen CTOs of like, you know, Citibank say, we need to be more like Google. In like the 3rd slide, 15 slides later, they have a slide that says do more with less. You know, like, no, that's not how Google does their business. They don't do more with less. They hire incredibly expensive. You take, when a person tries to leave Google for a startup, they basically add about $1 million to their yearly salary. Yeah. You know, so they don't do more with less. You know,
I was really surprised at the IT budget for like places like JP Morgan, and I mean, it's incredible how much money they spend, though. Like, it's more than Google.
Yeah. But again, you know, I mean, like, so a good friend of mine, I can't say who it is, but when you fire up a backup IBM mainframe, you immediately have to write $1 million check to IBM. Yeah. Right? So, like, and by the way, there are products called NetView and things like that, that the maintenance revenue, there's some, those budgets, there are millions and millions of dollars going to legacy budgets, but yes, the big banks, yeah, JP, Goldman is like, I mean, you know, they've been trying to figure out quantum for like trading applications. I mean, they put incredible amount of investment money into bleeding edge tech. I was at Docker. They were literally the first large financial institution that was going all in on figuring out how they could use containers for, you know, basically tier 1 trading applications. So they definitely do spend money.
Great. Okay. So another question from an anonymous source. We have a whistleblower in the room. So how do we overcome skepticism, resistance among non-tech stakeholders who can't imagine life without a cab? I have some opinions.
Yeah, you know, it all goes back to trust. And there's actually a couple of really good books written by Scott Prue, who was part of the sort of the Gene Kim sort of tribe of people. But like there's a methodical way, and it all comes back to you have to create the trust model. And I know it sounds simple, but it could be what we're talking about. It could be, so one of the things I had to take out of the slide deck because it was, I couldn't do it in 20 minutes, but one of the things that got me really interested in working with Topo Powell is back in 2017, they wrote at Capital One. He was the first fellow at Capital One. He wrote a blog article how they did their pipelines. This is 2017. And there's a great article out there, and if you want it, I can get a link to it. It's still very relevant. And he defined what he called 16 gates. And the idea was that they told the developers, if you could show evidence of these, and they're the basic things that you saw on my slide, right? This is back in 2007. They said to developers, if you can basically provide evidence for these 16 things, and we can pick it up, you don't have to go to the cab. Right? So it was that sort of the first model is the way you get rid of the cab is trusted data, right? And there's ways to create trust with non-tech. You know, I heard somebody say recently that like our auditors don't want to hear anything about SHAs or anything. Well, then what are they thinking about when they're asking questions about funds? Because that's all, it's all encrypted. And if it's not, they got, again, way worse problems than worrying about what we do. It's how you frame things. Like if you go to a second line and you talk about like SHAs and, crypto and we use Vault to do this, right, you're going to lose them. But if you try to explain it in a way that says the way we protect our system of record data and the data that, like our banking information, is the same model we're using. That reframes that conversation. We'll go, oh, I get it. Yeah, well, that makes sense. I think that's...
Yeah, I think we've got a question in the audience.
Oh, was that me?
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, you have the mic.
Yeah. It was just a comment just before you started this whole about the trust model, because I'm thinking that what is important, if you skip the part about the governance coming down and we go back to DevOps, we need to have legitimacy. I mean, I think that the developers that need to have a mandate, or they need to feel a legitimacy to the auditors or the ones controlling them, that they can give away the data, they can give away the code. The 16 gates of trust kind of thing is really important. And I have an example, if you want to hear it.
Yeah, no, I'd love to.
Because I wrote a master's thesis on the security police in Norway, because they had to do a complete reorg after the terror attack that we had the 22nd of July a few years back. My question to them was, how do you trust an organizational change? So what they did was that they asked all the departments' heads, what do you need to work? And they all said more money, more people, and then I'll fix it. And then they fired all of them. Literally, they had to apply for their own jobs. So the solution to all of this was that they asked everybody that worked on the very root level of the organization, what do you need to work? And they said, well, I need to talk to my colleague more. I need to sit in the same room. We need to establish the value chains from the bottom and then up. So they did that, and they did it all internally without any external company auditing them, and it's a completely different matter.
Like, don't even get me started on Dr. Deming, but because we will not end the day. But there's one of the probably the greatest 21st century research projects in our industry is called Project Aristotle by Google, and they asked one question. It was, how do you create great teams? And the single answer, although it's a ton of data, they talked to anthropologists, they talked to software, they talked to engineers, they interviewed an incredible wealth to figure out this question. And the answer was psychological safety. And if you think about the umbrella of psychological safety, it includes everything you just talked about. Because if I'm a junior female worker in a corporation that's been around for 30 years that has a bunch of fat old men like me, can that person say, I don't think that's going to work, and not get, you've been here for a week, how would you know? A psychologically safe person would we need to take a look at that. So you can't, I'm not saying for you, but it's easy to say we need to collaborate, but you can't have collaboration until you can take into account diversity and all these things that you can break down. And again, some of the best, strongest research that's ever happened in our industry comes out of something Google took called, and it just boils down to, and there's some really great resources of people who just track psychological safety. And I think it's the number one, there's two things, I'll get on my meta horse. Make me king for a day of a large CEO, of a CEO. Put me in front of a CEO, make a king for a day where they forced to listen to me. And there's two things I would tell them that they have to do systemically in that organization. One is systemically create pervasive psychological safety throughout the whole company. And the second was I'd want them to pervasively create a systemic mindset around systems thinking. Those are the two things I would basically create, and I would tell you everything else will fall into place.
Well, John, you have literally been here for a week. And in the interest of creating some psychological safety, it's time for our break. So we're going to break for 15 minutes, I believe. 10 minutes, I believe.
10 minutes.
So it's, and then we'll come back with some more talks. So see you soon.